Hi.
Hello, we're getting started. I hope you guys are well. I'm very well too. Okay, guys. So today we are going to talk about the exciting topic of politics. Politics, politics, politics. And my priority is, since we only have 1 hour and 15 minutes, my priority is to be as theoretical as possible. We're not going to be too practical. What I want to do, guys, is this. I want to expose you to the major political theories that exist, and this will kind of explain some of the current existing political systems and some of the political systems that have existed in history. And then, if we have time towards the end, I want us to go to Wikipedia and look up the brief introduction to the history of our current Democratic Party and the brief history of our current Republican Party. And then we'll get a sense for the ideological differences that currently exist between them, how that happened, and get into the details of the nuances of what politics actually means, especially for our country. And I think that's the best I can aim for. Because, guys, what we're talking about, these issues, they're so rich, there's so much history. I mean, there's been so much theorizing about it, and it's so relevant to you that I feel thrilled to have this honor to even talk about this. But in 1 hour and 15 minutes, guys, I mean, all I can do is just make some striking statements that'll, wake you up and, maybe make you, alert about how things work in this world. And that's about it. I mean, a class like this, I guess the best thing I can do is motivate you to learn more on your own, motivate you to carry the burdens we've been talking about, that kind of thing. But I mean, this stuff is so rich and there's just so much going on. When I was preparing for this class, I was looking at different textbooks, I was looking at Wikipedia, I was making notes of my own. I can't get through all that. I can't. So I'd rather just prioritize what I think is most helpful to you. All right? And that's what we're going to do now. So what's the basics you need to know? What's the basics you need to know about politics? Guys, I'm going to give you my own little framework. I think that what I'm going to say is very well grounded in reality, and I'm sure other people have said it. But after my own thinking about what politics truly boils down to, its core, these are the words that come to mind. And I think they're going to help you think this through. Here's what you need to know. Politics, when you think about that word politics, probably the word that first you associate with the word politics is power. Now, why is that the first word that comes to mind? Well, I think it's because the word politics comes from the ancient Greek word polis, which is kind of like a city-state. So back in ancient Greece, there were different tribes located in different cities, like Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, those kinds of things, right? So the unit of political activity was the city. And so this polis, which is a city-state, it's a very complex being. It's a city, which is a kind of, what is a city? An urban area. What is an urban area? That's an interesting topic. I guess it's related to the anthropological idea of civilization, right? One measure of a civilization is the existence of cities. I think I'm on the right track, right? One measure of civilization is cities. So in a city, as opposed to something like a village, in a city, some level of organization is necessary. You need coordination, you need a kind of harmony, you need order. Now, that cannot typically happen spontaneously like in a village. You get my point? When an organization, when a society is very small, like an extended family, a clan, or a tribe, and they're hunter-gatherers, or maybe they have small-scale subsistence agriculture, they can manage their affairs kind of spontaneously. Maybe they'll have some elders in the village who will, see to the education of the youth and kind of delegate tasks, and things get run pretty spontaneously. I would argue that there is political activity even in these primitive rural villages, or even in the hunter-gatherer stuff. The Native Americans were political, but for purposes of the history of politics as we know it in political philosophy, that word politics comes from polis. And it's in these city-states in ancient Greece that we have the kind of rulership. We have rulers who emerge as people who help with the organization of these cities, the running of the cities. Probably one of the most famous rulers in ancient Greece is Pericles. Pericles was the ruler of Athens at one of the most productive times in the history of Western culture. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they were all under Pericles. That's the time when you have great philosophy. That's the time when you have really, really good architecture, the Parthenon, you name it. Like, the city was rebuilt and rejuvenated under Pericles. And that already is a clue to one thing that we mean by politics and political activity. So if you are going to run a city, it's interesting, right? Someone who's running a city, ruling a city, is organizing it. But here's the word that I've really been meditating on that I think will best help you understand what politics is all about. So yes, politics is rightly associated with power, right? Someone needs to be in power so that things that cannot happen spontaneously and naturally will happen artificially, be forced by this artificial thing we call the state, right? The state. The state, guys, is not a natural thing. Let's do a little bit of metaphysics, right? What is the state? The cities, they're not natural technically. We can divide natural and artificial into two big categories. What are natural things? Well, all natural things are the things that are not man-made. That's one way to think about it. Anything not made by man is natural. So a landscape, a waterfall, a valley, a river. Are you catching my drift? But once you begin to organize a society in such a way that it needs this artificial thing called the state to help to run it, then now we're no longer natural and spontaneous like those hunter-gatherers or the nomads. Now we are engaged in an artificial art of rulership. And this art of ruling, that's why we think of politics in terms of power. Because in order for you to rule, you must have power, you must have authority, you must be respected. So one big thing that politics studies is, how is power transferred from the people who are ruled to the ruler? You get my point? How does that transfer legitimately happen? And under what conditions does it stop being legitimate, and therefore the people have the right to either have a revolution or revolt, or go to the poll, go vote and change the administration. All right, guys, I'm getting ahead of myself. I still haven't talked about this special word. This special word, which will elucidate and illuminate everything we're going to talk about, is a word you've heard. It's called interest. Interest. Every human being always has interests. Have you heard this word interest before? Yes, exactly. Perfect. Brilliant, Carter. That's exactly what I was getting at. When we're going to look at Wikipedia later, you're going to see, when we look at each party, you're going to see lobbyists, right? Lobbying is one political activity. Well, what do lobbyists do? They advance the interests of certain groups. Now, do you see why that word interest is helpful? We, sitting right here, have certain interests. This demographic we're in right now has certain interests. Let's go back to earlier classes we talked about. What are the basic identifying features of a person? Gender, race, sexuality. You see where I'm going? Each one of those things represents an interest. You see what I'm saying? People of a certain race will have typically certain interests. People of a certain gender will have certain interests. Think about feminism. Think about Black Lives Matter. That's a political activity that Black Lives Matter is engaging in. Think about the LGBT rights that we've slowly gotten through Harvey Milk and other people over time. That's another interest, your sexuality. So these things that we call politics, let's not get too distracted by the theory and thinking they're remote. No, they're embedded right in us. We need to eat. We are biological organisms. Food is what we might call a necessity. Sanitation, right? All those things. If you begin to think about all the interests you have just as a person, then all this politics stuff will begin to make sense slowly by slowly. All right, let's go. Guys, if you have roommates right now, then you have political activity. Whenever you meet about how you're gonna maintain your place, who's gonna, pay the rent, how much each person pays, what's a fair arrangement about cleaning common areas, cleaning personal areas, bathroom, kitchen. You guys see what I'm saying? That is a small society. All of these people have interests. They have the interests that need to be met by eating. They have the interests that have to be met by cleaning. What about the common areas? Maybe everyone takes care of their own area, but what about the common areas, right? That's a political activity because everyone has an interest in cleaning the common area. But who's going to do it and how? Whenever you have regular meetings, if you meet once a month to discuss house issues, that is political activity. You are representing your own interests at meeting. And to the extent that things get complex, and maybe you have to meet with everyone in your building, well, all four of you aren't going to go. So what are you going to do? You're going to choose a representative. And that person will represent the interests of your collective group. You see what I'm saying? What I'm trying to do, guys, is reintegrate politics back into your everyday common experience so that you feel the politics as a vital, robust, immediate thing, a concrete, particular thing that you live with every day. If you have conflicts with your roommates, that is political activity. How you resolve that conflict? Do you ask your roommate to step outside if he didn't wash the dishes? Do you have rules already set? He who doesn't wash the dishes once must compensate by doing it 2 or 3 times ahead later. All of that diplomacy, all of that tactfulness that you engage in when you address someone who you feel has wronged you or has been neglectful, that is political activity. Do you guys see where I'm going with this? That's the foundation I want you to start with. Of course, once you come to an environment like this, a classroom is a political environment. There are interests. You guys have interest in getting good grades. I have an interest in people paying attention to me. The university largely has interests. It has a board of trustees. There are stakeholders. Your parents have interest in you being here to the extent that they're paying tuition. If the government is giving you grants or financial aid or FAFSA, they have an interest in you successfully completing your schooling here. Why? Because when you successfully complete here, that is what will put you on the job market to be able to repay it. I'm just trying to make you sensitive to all these interests. They're active everywhere. So if some political leader says, our young students are burdened with too much student loans, I shall go and fight for their right to have their loans eliminated. That is an interest. That is not political activity at the highest level. That person campaigning on that promise to eliminate that debt, he is engaging in political activity for people like you and me. All right, now let's go back to the political theories. Okay, guys. That word interest is very, very important. But now we need to kind of configure the word interest in different configurations. One type of interest is what we might call needs, right? If you have basic needs that need to be met, that is one very specific type of interest, right? And we could focus on needs as the main political activity we're engaged in. Hence, it's no accident that a large part of politics depends on the economy. You see what I'm saying? If the economy provides goods and services that are supposed to meet the needs of the people, and by producing goods and services that are consumed by the people, they also, in meeting that demand, also create a supply of labor, that is a supply of jobs, that is a supply of meaningful or unmeaningful work through which people can get an income. Now, this thing called the economy, if you hear in the newspapers or in the media that, oh, the economy is the #1 issue that most voters vote on, I think that if a media outlet reports that way, they're not BSing. That is true. Because at the end of the day, if it is a fact that even in the United States, many, if not most people are in the working class and are therefore living paycheck to paycheck, my friend, these are not people who are thinking about philosophy and leisurely activities. They want the candidate who's going to get in office and engage in that political activity which will advance the interest that they have most immediately and on a daily basis. You see what I'm saying? So the economy, right? The economy, the state of the economy is urgent for many, many people. And the funny thing is, it's not just for the very poor or the working class. It's urgent for the middle class, and it's urgent for the rich too. Now, people are going to give different reasons why different people, different classes are interested in the economy, right? If you're rich and we stereotype all the rich as greedy, yeah, they're interested in the economy, but it's not need-based at this point. It's ambition-based, legacy-based. Maybe it is greed-based, I don't know. Maybe they just like exponential levels of success, and they like productivity and producing way beyond the amount they could ever consume. So their needs could never consume what they produce. Their bank accounts just get filled up with zeros and zeros and zeros, and a lot of their wealth isn't even representable or tangible in everyday life. It is abstract. Okay? So that's one kind of political interest in growing the economy or managing the economy. And then, of course, the other side, guys, the people living paycheck to paycheck. Now, they could get stereotyped as unambitious, not entrepreneurs, slothful, lazy. You are where you are because of who you are. Your work ethic is why you are where you are. That's what the counter accusation might be. Laziness, greed on one side and laziness on the other. All right, maybe there's some truth to that. I don't know. But the point is, if these people go to vote, we can already see how, even though they'll both be concerned with quote unquote the economy, they're going to be their interests are very different in this economy. One of them wants the economy, the pie, to expand. You see that? The people who just want more and more and more wealth, total, they want the aggregate amount, the total amount of wealth to expand. And since the system is set up such that most income is flowing to the top 1% or 10%, they know that if it expands by default, in a system like ours that's capitalist, they will get most of the wealth. So they want expansion of the economy, unregulated expansion of the economy. That's their interest. But there's another type of interest in the economy, not how big it gets, but how it is divided. You see that? Those are two different interests. And we're going to look hopefully at Wikipedia towards the end of class. And on Wikipedia, you'll see very clearly, typically the modern Republican Party, right, is the party that says, get the government out of regulating the economy, because Americans are naturally hard workers, entrepreneurs, and they will grow the economy naturally. And just by growing the economy, by default, that will create goods and services, that will meet people's needs, and by default, just as an after effect, it will also create jobs. You see that? So they have an interest in saying, get government out of society as much as possible and get rid of all of this interference and regulation of the economy and of people's private lives. I'm sure this sounds familiar, right? When you think about Republican Party, when you think about conservative principles, this is where it comes from. And this kind of get the government out of our private affairs, get the government out of the private sector, because the private sector is what's truly productive. The private sector is where true genius and true capital is, not in government, which is inefficient. That kind of spirit, if we think in technical terms, they are fighting for a certain kind of right. These are what we call negative rights. When we say negative rights, what do we mean? Well, they want a constitution and a country that keeps the government out of private life as much as possible. Private life means the family, the church, the business, all of that needs to be as unregulated as possible, because there's a deep faith that people left to their own are fundamentally good and hardworking, and they are the backbone of the economy. That's where Atlas Shrugged comes from, right? You get that idea of Atlas Shrugged? That's the kind of idea. The more government tinkers and manipulates and regulates, it just messes up. They have no idea what they're really doing, and it's just botching and bungling things. That's the spirit. So it's called negative rights because it's saying this: I have the right for you not to interfere with me at all. Only under emergency conditions do you have the right to interfere with me. So yes, a government does need to protect us from outsiders. So there's a military, right? A lot of Republicans are very big on the military. Conservatives are big on the military. We do need to protect ourselves, because if we can't protect ourselves, no economic activity at all is going to get done. So the hardworking citizens of this country need to be protected. But not just from external enemies, but also from what? From internal enemies. So law and order will be a big thing with conservatives. You can see that, right? A good market that runs efficiently needs peace. It needs peace. So law and order is the way to make peace, right? You see that idea? We need law and order to the extent that it protects our property, our rights, our liberties, and lets us go on with our lives peacefully. That's where economic activity really happens. Okay, so for the most part, economies grow during peaceful periods. There is a qualification to that. During war times, also there's a kind of economic stimulus, right? If the whole nation gears up to producing weapons and things like that, that is a kind of economic activity. And quite frankly, an economy can do quite well during those periods. But that's an exception. For the most part, economies do well during peace. Therefore, law and order and a large military On the right, conservatives, they'll be big on that. Now let's look at the other kind of right, positive rights. On the left, right? What are positive rights? Well, positive rights are also known as entitlements. You'll hear this rhetoric a lot in the media. People feel so entitled, right? If you hear about programs, social welfare programs, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, these are called entitlements because you don't deserve these rights because you earned them, right? Not because you're hardworking or anything. Just by virtue of being a citizen, just by virtue of being a human being, you have certain human rights. And so, these positive rights are positive because it's not preventing the government from intruding in your life. It's exactly the opposite. It's putting an obligation on the government. It's saying, not that you're prohibited from interfering, but I want you to positively interfere in the economy. Positively. Interfere, please, and redistribute wealth from those who could never consume all that they have, the super rich, do a progressive tax or whatever, and give it to those who, again, are living paycheck to paycheck or are super sick, right? There's many different things you can do with the Social Security system, Medicare, Medicaid. And this gets back into history, guys. Just before the Second World War, there was an event that was happening, particularly in this country, that caused FDR to start something new. You guys know what I'm talking about? What's the name of the economic thing that happened? Go ahead.
The New Deal.
Very good. That's right. That's exactly right. Guys, there are business cycles and there are economic cycles. The bottom line is, economies are not stable. I'm not an economist, so I don't know all the factors that lead to the rise and fall. All I know is that economies are not stable. And so at some point in our history, certain theories about economies and economic activity became influential and influenced government policy. So Keynesian economics, Keynes was a British economist, and he basically said, look, there's this thing called aggregate demand that can be stimulated by government spending. So if the government spends meaningfully on projects that create a whole bunch of jobs and introduce into the economy a whole bunch of economic activity, then it can create a demand which will artificially create a supply, and that's how you can temporarily rescue an economy out of a recession. You see that? That's the basic idea. But of course, there are hostile voices on the other side. Milton Friedman or Hayek, these are people who will say absolutely not. The best economy is one which, yes, goes through ups and downs, but there's health in the downs. There's something happening that is pure economic, how should you say, like an immune system or something. Here's what I mean by that, guys. If economics is defined as the allocation of resources, right, then any system that allocates resources efficiently and fairly is a great system. But if these economic cycles are kind of inevitable, then one way to interpret what's happening during a recession is there is a reallocation of resources from places where it's not needed to places where it truly is needed. You see what I'm saying? So the people who, like Milton Friedman and Hayek, who say, oh, okay, still, even when people are suffering, you still should have minimal government interference. What they're saying is, look, these cycles are inevitable, but they're also healthy. Why? Because sometimes people overproduce. Sometimes people overconsume. And so resources get misallocated naturally, but the adjustment necessary also happens naturally. And so again, if the government gets involved, it barely knows what it's doing, and will just mess things up and delay the natural recovery that would have happened anyway. You see what I'm saying? So depending on which economic historian you listen to, the New Deal was the greatest thing ever and the worst thing ever, right? Some people are going to say, like the Milton Friedmans, they're going to say, it's precisely because you interfered that you delayed the recovery. Remember, guys, it's all about interpretation. Data doesn't say anything by itself. The same data can mean different things to different people. So whatever period it took for the US or the global economy to recover, there's going to be revisionist economics. They're going to say, like, look, people tell this romantic story about FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was the hero who saved the economy and saved the people, blah, blah, blah. And they're going to be like, no, he delayed a natural recovery. I'm not an economist, guys. I'm bringing all this up to say, we cannot talk about politics meaningfully if we don't talk about the number one issue that drives it. Because on the horizon is two systems that dictate how property is allocated in the political system. Like literally, those are the two big systems we see in the world. It's all about property. Do you know what I'm talking about? What are those two systems? In other words, I'm saying there are two political systems that exist right now. For the most part, in most countries, it's divided into two, especially after the Cold War. One of those systems says private property is the basis of a good economy, and therefore politics is all about protecting that and building on that. And the other system is all about, hey, you know what? To have property is already a kind of offense. It's a kind of stealing. In a true village, we should share duties and we should share benefits. And what is the world but a big global village? What is a country but a big village? So ideally, what should we be doing? Sharing burdens and sharing benefits. And then remember, there's a special philosopher who said, from each according to his need, and to each from each according to his ability, and to each according to his need. Remember us talking about that? What philosopher was that? He's the one who says, look, property, especially property of capital and the means of production, that is like problematic. We shouldn't have a whole bunch of people owning the means to production. Maybe a bit of private property in terms of just personal belongings. I don't know about real estate, but anything less than real estate maybe is okay. Do you know what I'm talking about? From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Marx, right? Karl Marx, he said that. So Karl Marx is going to be communist, socialist, that kind of area, right? So guys, that's what runs the world. That was Marx's theory. Marx's theory was that basically all the significant changes we see in history, all the theories and the philosophies and the sciences and the arts, he thought that all that intellectual stuff is driven by economic changes. Literally, the true history of the world is a materialist history of the world. If you want to understand what's driving history, it's not what Hegel thought, which was like spirit and idealism. No. Marx said, what really drives history, what drives revolutions, political revolutions, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, if you really want to understand that, understand who is in charge of the property, who owns the means of production. That's how you figure out the meaning to history and the meaning to the changes we've seen in history, and also what's on the horizon, the revolution that's coming of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. That is, the working class is going to, in his theory, in his mind, the working class is going to swell up so much, so at some point they're going to outnumber the capitalists, and it's going to be like an overnight thing. They're just going to seize power because they're so numerous. And that, in his idea, would be the communist revolution that would bring in a new utopia from each according to his ability and to each according to his need. Guys, I'm not going to get into the history of whether or not that was successful. Russia, China, North Korea. You got to look that up on your own. We don't have time. But the other system, which was famously articulated most clearly by Adam Smith, a Scottish philosopher from the Scottish Enlightenment, that actually was that actually was the basis of our current free market capitalism, right? When we say free market, emphasis on free, right? I don't know what a market is, guys. Again, I've never taken economics. I don't know if it's an institution or it's a lack of institution. I know one way to think about a market is, there's a whole bunch of buying and selling going on, right? So commerce is one way to think about what a market is. There's always a demand for goods and services of all kinds. There's a demand for labor in order to produce those goods and services. That's the basic idea. So free market capitalism, also known as classical liberalism, that is the philosophy that says, again, the wealth of nations, because Adam Smith wrote a book, The Wealth of Nations. How do nations really get wealthy? If you want to know, it's not by generosity, not by a bunch of saints doing noble deeds and heroic activities. No. That good old thing called selfishness. For Adam Smith, being self-interested, again, that word interest, having interests, and then doing your best to meet your own interests, right? That's what entrepreneurs are built of, right? Those are people who enter a scene and from the beginning, they already assess what the resources are, they have some idea of what the demand is and how to meet that demand. So they need the freedom to collect capital, also known as resources, and then produce goods and services that meet either existing demands or demands that maybe don't exist now, but you create Facebook, and people learn about it, and suddenly demand just happens naturally because it's a good product. People discover that they love it. They discover that it's a great thing. All right, guys, that foundation I've given you in terms of interests and positive rights and negative rights, right? Again, negative rights are like civil and political rights, right? Negative rights are things like the right to freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, right to do whatever to worship whatever religion you want. Those are negative rights. Then positive rights are things like the right to social and economic goods, right? So negative rights are things like the right to engage in whatever political activity you want, freedom from interference from the government unless absolutely necessary, and freedom to engage in whatever acquisition of capital or property you want so that you can do whatever you want with it. On the other side, it's a bunch of people who say, hey, the role of government isn't just to not interfere. Under certain circumstances, actually government should interfere, right? So the conservatives have no problem with the government taking taxes for military and police activity, right? The right has no problem with that. But they would have a problem with people taking money from them and then just living off of welfare for the rest of their life, or public education, things like that. Whereas on the left, they're going to be like, hey, we're progressives. Another name for liberals is progressives. And they would say, look, the role of government is to serve the people. Whatever the people need, those employers that we have up in the Oval Office, those representatives, their duty is just to cater to us, whatever we want. They are a function, and their function is to serve us, whatever we need. So if the people need a stimulus check to make it through a recession, no problem. Welfare, food stamps, whatever support is necessary, whatever the people need, social and economic rights, in addition to civil and political rights, that's what we want. All right, guys. Any questions? Because now that I've set it up that way, I can go quickly through a whole bunch of political theories. It's only like 3 or 4 really big ones. Now that you understand interests, now that you understand positive and negative rights, and now that you understand kind of a little bit of the ideological differences between conservatives and liberals, we can go back all the way to ancient Greece again. Athens, Plato. Plato, I think, is the first philosopher, the first person to really introduce this idea of a utopia. You guys know what a utopia is? What is it? Ideal society where there's a maximum of happiness and a minimum of disease and everything is going great. So in Plato's Utopia, the important thing to understand is that if you're going to understand the kind of government that he likes and the kind of government he doesn't like, you got to go back to his metaphysics. Plato believes in the existence of this thing called the soul. And he thinks that what we see in society is a kind of mirror image of the soul. So when he looks at his soul, or the average person's soul, he sees a structure there, an order. And this order, or this organization, is capable of two basic states: harmony and order, or disharmony and disorder. So, a healthy soul is one where we have lots of harmony. All the parts in the structure, all the parts in the organization are staying in their own lane and doing their own job properly. That's his understanding of a healthy soul. And a diseased soul is where different parts are stepping out of their lane and trying to dictate to other parts what to do. And because that's what's happening inside the soul, he also thinks that an orderly society is one where, again, every part of society is doing its proper job. And a disorderly society, a diseased society, is one where there's basically chaos and anarchy. There's no order. So this concept of order, guys, it's a very, how do you say it, aristocratic idea. The idea that there should be some order. Because order has two implications. One, the idea that there is this thing called order. It means that there's discrimination going on. There's a rank between things. There's a rank between virtues. There's a rank between values. And I'm sad to say this, there's also a rank between people. And this makes him not a democrat, because democracy is based on equality. Plato is an aristocrat. But he's not an aristocrat in that crass sense of, oh, I'm blue blood, you know, I have a lot of money, and I have a bunch of property, and I'm well respected just because the line, my hereditary line, goes back centuries. It's not that kind. He is an aristocrat purely in the sense of the intellectual people, the ones with the best ideas, are the ones who should rule society. So it's the ideas aspect, the people who are most rational or most intellectual. In other words, hint, hint, the philosophers. He believes that in the best possibly ordered state, the people with the clearest and most distinct and best and noblest ideas, the philosophers basically, they are the ones who are supposed to rule society. And so what's going on in the soul, what's going on in a healthy soul for Plato is that all the parts are properly coordinated and subordinated. So in a healthy soul, he finds three basic parts. He finds reason, which rules everything else. And why reason, right? It's a natural thing, guys. If reason is the one that can, quote unquote, see everything through its wisdom, through its calculations, through its logic, if it's the one that discriminates and finds stuff out, well, it's got to be the ruler because everything depends on that, right? Changes in environment are detected by reason through the senses, and also the order of values is determined by reason, like discrimination. All right? But reason is only one part. There's another part of the soul that's more the motivation, the emotion, the drive, and that is basically translated in English as spirit. So there's the reason on top, and there's the spirit, and the spirit is supposed to enforce or be the agent of the reason. And then at the bottom, you have one last part, which is the desires and those appetites. Appetites, things like food, drink, sex. Appetites at the bottom. You need that just to survive. But that's a very blind, unconscious thing. And if you let that rule your life, you live a life kind of like a heroin addict, right? Just slothful, just gluttonous, alcoholic. That's a very unconscious life if you let the appetites rule. Spirit is a bit nobler. It's better. Like someone who has a hot temper and is eager to get into battle. That's noble. That's respectable. But that too is rather unconscious. Someone who's constantly getting in fights and doesn't even know why he is. Okay, he might have skill and he might be an alpha male, but he's still rather unconscious. But if you introduce the final element, the reason, and the reason subordinates the spirit, and the spirit subordinates the appetite, then he thinks you have a healthy soul. And guys, that's why he's an aristocrat, because he sees the same thing in society. If you have rational, intellectual people like philosophers ruling society, then they will understand what is in its best interest. So that word interest comes, right? You must identify the best interest of everyone. And that means you need someone who has the capacity to quote unquote see. But who sees? It's the rational people. It's the people who are concerned with ideas. So those who can see are to be in charge. And then those who have force and strength should obey the reason and subdue the appetites. And then the blind appetites, of course, agriculture, carpenters, we need them. They're necessary, but they need to be subordinated. And that's exactly what we see in Athens during his time. There was democratic activity, but there were also aristocrats. It's very complex. You tell the history of Greece, it's too complex. The history of Athens, very complex. Plato was an aristocrat, just to be clear. He was born into an aristocratic family, and he was partly expected to rule, but he got corrupted by that seducer called Socrates. So that was that. He became a philosopher. And Plato even tried to start his own city. Oh, go ahead, Carter.
What was the
Spirit. It means motivation or desire. So guys, that's it. Plato is an aristocrat, and aristocracy is a form of government in which the rulers are the best. But for Plato, the best are not really the richest or anything. It's just those who are best equipped to govern, and that's the ones with the best ideas, and that's for him a philosopher. He tried a little experiment to form his own city. It didn't work. But Athens, he was not able to rule. And I think he had a bitter experience after they killed his master, Socrates. So, yeah, he is not democratic. He's anti-democratic. Why? Because he would interpret democracy as something like, let the blind appetites dictate policy. And so reason, instead of enforcing and ruling, will become something like a panderer. So what's going on in our country, for example, he would interpret as, I see. There isn't leadership and statesmanship going on here. What's happening is you promise a bunch of stuff, people vote for you, and then you vote in their interests. Depending on how corrupt you are, you may or may not. But even if you're not corrupt, let's say you deliver on your promises, from his perspective, all you've done is you've taken a bunch of appetites, you've taken a bunch of people who don't have any ideas about what's best, and then you've promised what you think they want to hear, and then they elect you into power, and you give them what they want. That's not a leader. That's something like you know what I mean, right? That's just a panderer. That's someone who wants power, but he's not going to use the power to dictate what's in the best interest of everyone from a kind of foresight. There's no sight. You want raw power, and probably you want it for your own private interest. So when Plato thinks about democracy, he sees a whole bunch of people who are very plain working people. They have no ideas. So they are excitable by bad arguments, rhetoric, slogans, they're very emotional. They are themselves unhealthy souls. So if you court them, then you're just exploiting their chaos. They put you into power. You maintain power by throwing them a few scraps and giving them a few more promises to stay in office. And that's that. You probably are just Machiavellian and you're doing your own thing. And you're exploiting this democracy as a demagogue. He's not very optimistic about democracy as a great form of government. And guys, if you really think about it, honestly, even if the majority agrees on something, does that fact alone make it right from an ethical point of view? If the majority agrees that the minority should be slaves, okay, is that democracy? If the majority agrees that, yeah, we don't want gay people anymore. Homosexuality is illegal now. Just think about what in Plato's words, it would be a mob, or the rabble, or the masses. Think about what the average public opinion floating around the average person is, as reflected in our newspapers, in our tabloids, on YouTube channels. What does the average person think? It's interesting. If you combine democracy with education, it gets even more complicated, right? Does someone stop being appetitive if they get a bachelor's degree? It's a very tricky question. If someone becomes an accountant or an investment banker or a lawyer or a doctor, have they really graduated from being appetitive and kind of become philosophers of rational? Something to think about. Because some people might say, hey, what's necessary in a democracy is education, so that task assigned for Plato to the aristocracy, it comes down, it trickles down, right? You get educated, and then you're no longer appetitive. You're sophisticated, you understand what's right and wrong, you understand what's better or worse, and then when you vote, it's meaningful. In that scenario, right? But I don't know, what is education? Something to think about. Okay, guys, let me see how much time we have. All right, I think I have enough time. So guys, that's Plato, and he's offering a utopia. He says, look, if you just get order, harmony, he has a special name for this kind of order or harmony. He calls it justice. For him, justice is the exact opposite of equality. To truly be just is to say, you, my friend, are very intellectual. You should lead. And then to truly be just is say, oh my God, you have an amazing physique. You are so brave. You should be a guardian. You should be the spirited class, the warrior class. And then you are expert at agriculture, so you should practice agriculture. That for him is justice. Because we have to face a very uncomfortable fact, guys. Are people equal or are they not? And this is a very uncomfortable discussion, given our racial history, gender history. I mean, someone could make a very stinging remark, like, oh, just look at the history of philosophy. How many non-white males do you see there? How many women? How many minorities? That's an uncomfortable, discussion to have. Are people equal or aren't they? And when we use the word equal, what are we referring to? Are we talking about their socioeconomic status? Are we talking about abilities? Are we talking about intelligence? Certain minorities, like African Americans, they typically score low on standardized tests. Where is this equality? Certain people perform much better in certain sports. If you look at marathons or sprints, basketball, you tend to see certain people. Where is this equality? If you see a distribution in society, in certain sectors, in certain fields, certain sports, in certain arts, in certain music, and academics, again, where is equality and what are the implications of that? If you don't see equality, does that imply that someone is being suppressed? Does that imply that there's a kind of systemic racism? That is political, guys. That means there might be someone who's interested, who has an interest in keeping certain races or genders out of power. And that's where feminism becomes a very political issue. There have been different waves of feminism, right? first, second, third. Each one was evolving in terms of the refinement of its understanding of its interests. I'm just going to leave that there. All right, guys. So, after understanding the Platonic aristocratic understanding of what politics is and what ruling is and how you achieve the best interest of everyone in society, let's jump right into the 17th century, Hobbes and Locke, and also Rousseau, but we're not going to Rousseau too much. Hobbes and Locke are the main ones of something called social contract theory. This is the theory, guys, that basically says, bottom line, on the whole, before people enter these cities and these states, these political states, they are living in what we call a state of nature. So they're continuous with the animal kingdom. Yeah, we might be rational animals in the sense that we use language, and sometimes we can use language really technically, so it gets logical. But for the most part, we're brutes. Now, I put Rousseau on the side, because I don't know if I've talked to you about Rousseau before, but Rousseau had a very optimistic view of this primitive condition. This state of nature for Rousseau is almost a kind of utopia, almost. It has its harsh aspects, but for the most part, he thinks civilization corrupts, right? As soon as people engage in all this sophisticated art and science and philosophy, and they grab power, and they have all this idleness, that corrupts culture very quickly. But let's put Rousseau to the side. We've already discussed them. Hobbes and Locke basically emphasize that, look, especially Hobbes is really good at this. He says, for the average human being in a state of nature, he is fully animalistic. And he is competing for scarce resources with every other human being, and even sometimes with wild animals. So he is in a war of all against all. When every individual has to think about himself and his own self-interest, you don't get that elegance that we see with Adam Smith, where everyone's self-interest creates a drive in the market to become suppliers and producers. And everything works out great because that needs some demands and some consumption. Now, for Hobbes, the view is in this primitive state, the alpha males are clashing with each other and they're suppressing the beta males, and life is short. You live a short life because resources are scarce. Every day you've got to reassert yourself to fight for more resources. Life is nasty, short, brutish, harsh. That's his vision of what life is before the state. So, yes, in this primitive state, you have a kind of wildness and freedom, and that's what Rousseau romanticized. He loved that side of things because he thought we were simpler and more naive and less cunning in that state. But put Rousseau aside, Hobbes sees a bunch of people who are mostly animal and at some point recognize, hey, life is pretty harsh on my own. But what if we came together? What if we formed a political unit? Hobbes calls it the Leviathan. So what if we came together and formed a political unit? We gave up some of that sweet liberty. We can't do whatever we want, whenever we want, however we want. But what do you get in exchange? You guys tell me. In exchange for liberty, what do you think he thinks the state gives you in return? Remember what I talked about earlier. You give up your liberty, you can't do whatever you want, but what does the state give you, and what does the state have a monopoly on? Yeah, protection, violence. You get security in return for liberty. See that? Very elegant, right? Security in return for liberty. What does this mean, guys? Life gets a little bit better. Maybe it gets a lot better, right? Life isn't so harsh, so nasty, so short. Now all of a sudden, you act tame. You're not so animalistic. You have to become domesticated and tame. You can't do whatever you want. And in return, there's law and order. And you can conduct economic activity, agriculture, and you can live a mild, level life. Disease will begin to decrease. Your lifespan will increase. You get the idea? That's his image. Now, I need to make a very important remark. He's not claiming that this transition from the state of nature to rule by the Leviathan actually happened at any particular period in actual history. He's not telling a historical story. Instead, this social contract is just a kind of fiction, a convenient fiction that helps us make sense of why people would respect someone who has a monopoly on violence. You get my point? Here's a person who's governing. The mystery is, how did this happen? How could a bunch of people give up their own power and give all this authority concentrated into one person, which for most of history has typically been a monarch? So Hobbes is really thinking, how did that happen? And the idea is that they get together and they agree with the ruler, hey, we're going to give you this power, and in return, you give us security. Now again, this is a fiction. He's not committed to any particular society in history actually doing this. He can't tell a story about that actual agreement happening or anything like that. All he's doing is he's creating a fictional story that will make sense of the transfer of power from governed to the governed, to the government. All right? And that's it, guys. That's Hobbes' idea. So, what's most important here? Rights and right and wrong, ethics, right and wrong, and also political rights for Hobbes all come from the state. Your rights come from the state. In the state of nature, I think Hobbes is committed to something like there is no right and wrong, and you don't have any rights because there is no law. All law begins with the state, and all law is derivative from the state's rights, from the state's laws. Does that make sense? Now we're going to talk about Locke. Locke overlaps heavily with Hobbes in some respects. He too believes that, hey, life is not so great. He doesn't think it was that bad, but he also agrees life is not so great on your own. So you do form a kind of contract, and the power of the monarch or the power of the ruler is derivative from the power of the people. Should they rescind it, should they take it back, he loses that power. So, particularly for Locke, this means in Locke's case, one difference with Hobbes is that if the monarch abuses his power, the transfer can be revoked, it can be taken back. That's one thing. The other thing that's very, very important, the rights in the case of Locke do not come from the state. The rights in the case of Locke do not come from the state. Instead, God, or whoever you want to say, gives us inalienable rights. Guys, when you hear that word inalienable, what comes to mind? What does inalienable mean? Go ahead.
The right to liberty, pursuit of property.
Exactly. Where is that found? What document?
Declaration.
Excellent, guys. So, I just want to drop a little footnote here. Guys, philosophy is not all abstract and detached. It has had influence on actual history. Our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, they were some of the most refined, and I don't even want to use the word educated because that sounds too vulgar. These are some of the noblest, most wise people in history. And they were influenced by a philosopher, Locke. Locke articulated this vision of our modern notion of true human rights. Because when he says that your right is inalienable, it doesn't depend on the state. And what does that mean? That means when you come together and form a state, all that a state can truly do is protect the rights you already have. You see that? In other words, the state respects what God created or what nature created. You know what I mean? The state, again, is put in its proper place, and it's a subordinate position. It's the people who are truly the foundation of the society and the state. And so the state only has derivative power. This is even more apparent in Locke than in Hobbes. Okay? Any questions, guys? We're almost done. Let me see how much time we have. Oh, we got 10 minutes. That's good. We might be able to look at Wikipedia. So, guys, all that's really left now, I wanna kind of broaden your horizons. I talked about needs, right? But there's some other criteria we need to think about. Needs might not exactly coincide with what we saw in utilitarianism, right? People are more complex than just their basic needs. They also have wants, you know what I mean? Sophisticated desires, not the desires that will keep you healthy or surviving. You know, this love of art and refinement and museums and hiking. All of these are kinds of goods and services, you know? So another way you could structure a society is by maximizing utility, kind of like consequentialism, right? You could say, look, it's not just about needs. The way we should distribute things in society, power should be directed at maximizing utility for everyone. Make as many people as happy as possible. Yeah, it's not about needs, it's about happiness. Human beings have this capacity to feel terrible, terrible pain and tremendous bliss. And that's what we need to be modulating. That's the axis. So that's a utilitarian understanding. Another understanding, guys, is merit. Merit. There are some people who just work hard, man. Like, guys, you know some lawyers are going to work like 70 hours a week, 80 hours a week, doctors. There are entrepreneurs out there who are starting startups. That initial investment into the startup, whether you're doing venture capitalism or whatever, that is like maybe like 90 hours a week, you know? I mean, like, it is, in other words, whether merit is intelligence or merit is work ethic, either way, there is this other aspect of being human, a kind of excellence, right? And we gotta think, hey, wait a minute. Should we be a meritocracy? Kind of like Plato, but a bit different. I think America is a democracy in one sense. It's also a meritocracy. Can you see why I would say that? When people talk about the American dream, they're not talking about just surviving. They're talking about being the next Steve Jobs, being the next Bill Gates. And so a large part of the immigrants who come here, when they think about the American dream, they're not talking about just, oh, I can go to America and be equal. No. There's self-selection. A lot of the immigrants who come here, they come here precisely because they saw Donald Trump become president and they want to be that. They want to be Steve Jobs. They want to be Bill Gates, you know? So this is very, very interesting. We are a democracy in one sense. We are a republic in one sense. We've got a liberal constitution in one sense. But when you look at what CEOs actually make compared to the rest of the people in their corporate organizations, in their corporations, and to the rest of the, man, I think we have meritocratic elements. So merit, excellence, hard work, that's a very deep thing we need to think about. It's an aspect of being human. If someone runs at the Olympic Games, the idea that he should share honors with someone else on the basis of need or something like that, that glory seems to go properly to him. He exercised, he watched his diet, he had a good coach, he gave up comfort and convenience. Why should he share the glory? And if glory is expressed in economic terms, well, right? Why should someone share their wealth? Of course, this gets complicated. Not everyone who's wealthy is merit-based. I think Paris Hilton might have some merit of her own, maybe not. Kim Kardashian too. But some people simply inherit their wealth, right? That's my point. So, what do we do in those cases? And in the case of someone like Paris Hilton, her whole business model is of conspicuous consumption, right? So if you're famous for being famous, well, if you take a lot of selfies and you're constantly, followed by paparazzi, you could call that a business, I guess. But if you look at your activity, is it a merit? I don't know. It's interesting. And we got a whole culture now on Instagram and other places that's kind of like, look at me, I'm making money, I'm famous for being famous, I'm famous for being on Instagram. That's a whole culture now. Is that merit or is that not? Something to think about. All right, guys, the last thing I want to bring up, just like need is a value and merit is a value and utility is a value, Last but not least, guys, equality is a value, a brute value. And especially in a nation that has a history like ours, where there were suppressed groups like women and racial minorities and LGBT, some people are just going to say, you know what, all I want is to be treated like everyone else. Why? Because I am a person. You see what I'm saying? Not me. We're not talking about need here. I'm not talking about merit. They're not talking about utility. They're saying there's this thing called the person, and I think I qualify. You kind of get the point? There's this thing called the person. We're not all identical, but to the extent that, to the extent that certain laws are legislated for this thing called a person, why should there be segregation? Why should one person get paid more than another? You kind of see what I'm saying? So there's a lot of federal legislation that was passed in the 60s and then again later on to kind of make that happen. So all of that is interest. All of that is political activity. And then last, guys, you already know this. The last thing we're going to talk about is just socialism and liberalism. I mean, socialism and classical liberalism or capitalism. Guys, I think you understand these things, right? Like the bottom line is many nations for the past century, the 20th century was very interesting. Starting in 1917, we had a revolution in Russia, and then we had communism for a while. Looks like it didn't work, but I don't know what that means. Does that mean that Marx's vision was wrong, and when they implemented it, it just didn't work? Or does that mean that Marx's vision was right, but it wasn't implemented well? Those are, I'm sure, whole books have been written about that. But the bottom line behind communism, I've already shared it with you, it's the idea that we can evolve a better society where we're not living paycheck to paycheck. Instead, while 1% owns 50% of the wealth and the rest of us are starving and we don't have a living wage and we're living paycheck to paycheck, Marx's basic idea is, look, we can reorganize things in a much fairer way. And I think some interpretations of Marxism and communism go something like this. Not only can we make things more fair in terms of distribution, but maybe, just maybe, if we grab control of all property and all investments and all means of production, we can actually make society less materialistic. In other words, we can reduce the role played by material things in society so that overall less economic activity is necessary overall so that we can have more leisure, more time with family, more cultural activities, you know what I mean? More festivals. That's one way to think about what Marx is getting at. He sees workers suffering, and he wants redistribution, that's true, but not redistribution just so you can spend all day making things equal. No, redistribution so that by redistributing things properly, the whole amount of economic activity goes down, and you have a bunch of free people. Maybe they work, I don't know, 20 hours a week, something like that. You see that? That's a different vision from just tinkering with equality and making sure the women are equal to the men and the gay people are equal to everybody else. I don't think it was just that petty. I think it was a larger vision. And then with classical liberalism, guys, I mean, there's data. I mean, Adam Smith was just looking at raw data, saying, look, some nations are wealthier than others. The only story, the only compelling story I can tell about how they got that wealthy is through freedom. People were able to allocate resources according to supply and demand freely. And yes, there will be business cycles, there'll be ups and downs, but they adjust themselves. So he called it the invisible hand. He said, there's an invisible hand that meets in society. And he's talking about supply and demand. You don't see it, but just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's the government doing it. The government is not the invisible hand. The government isn't doing some central planning, some central orchestration of things. No. Naturally, spontaneously. Demands are created just by being human, and just by being human, the need to make profit off of those demands creates supply. So consumption naturally leads to production, and markets adjust over time. Markets can fail sometimes too. Not everything in the markets is great, but you know, that's that. Any questions before we just take a glimpse at Wikipedia? You feel like you have a keen sense of the landscape. Guys, this class is so short that I can't go into the details. I would love to have a whole class just on political philosophy, but I'm trying to do what's in your best interest, you know? So, all right, guys, we're at 7:50. Yikes. Okay, let's go to Wikipedia. Wikipedia. Okay, Wikipedia. Huh. Okay. All right. Democratic Party, United States. All right, I'm going to screen share this so everyone can see. Yeah. All right. Okay. All right, we're screen sharing now. All right. Okay. The Democratic Party is one of the two major contemporary political parties in the United States, along with its main rival, the Republican Party. Tracing its heritage back to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison's Democratic Republican Party, the modern-day Republican Party was founded around 1828 by supporters of Andrew Jackson, making it the world's oldest active political party. Very interesting. So what they're saying there, guys, is it can trace its roots and its values back to Thomas Jefferson, but Andrew Jackson was the first actual Democratic president. One thing we'll talk about just briefly, I'm not even going to read it there. Originally, Southern states were very, very much part of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was actually pro-state sovereignty or state rights, and that's coded language for, you know, if it's before the Civil War and you're talking about states' rights, what's the primary right you think they want to be defended? Slavery. So our current Democratic Party, guys, is very different. It evolved, but I have to tell you, its roots lie in slavery. They were very conservative originally, but this changed over time. I don't know the full story. I confess my ignorance. I don't know the full story of how or why it changed. I would love to read that. Maybe it's on Wikipedia. Maybe it's in a book in the library. I don't know everything, and I'm not going to mislead you. I'm not even going to speculate. I just know that at some point it changed. All right. Yeah, the Republican Party. Go ahead.
Well, I just remember this from previous lessons in high school. I think there's about 5 realignment periods when both political parties have severe shifts in their ideals. And one of them I know for a fact was during Reconstruction post-Civil War, where a ton of the Dixie Southern Democrats became more Republican and exemplified their ideals, while the Republicans in the North were more exposed to the Industrial Revolution and the Industrial Era, more shifted towards Democratic.
Excellent. That's exactly what I was going to go to. You said it perfectly. So, guys, yeah, again, economics explains a lot of politics. What Nick just said. So, in the North historically was more industrialized than the South. Free market principles govern their thinking of how to, maximize the economy. Whereas in the South, it was much more slave labor. And I have to note this. There was a French aristocratic lawyer called Alexis de Tocqueville. He actually made a very interesting observation. Because the South was slave labor based, the cultural implications of that is that the South was pretty much aristocratic. The South was pretty much aristocratic. Whereas in the North, since immediately you're born, you have to work for everything and you don't have servants or slaves, you are going to be more against slavery, and you're going to see every slave as an underutilized resource. You see that? Because you're going to believe that free labor is more efficient than slave labor. So, yeah, like Nick said, that shift came about because industrialism happened faster in the North than in the South. And bottom line, guys, yeah, that changed. So the last thing I want to read you here is the Democratic Party's philosophy of modern liberalism blends notions of civil liberty and social equality with support for a mixed economy. Now, this is Wikipedia, guys, so I don't know who wrote this, so they have biases. All I'm trying to note is when you hear the rhetoric on the media, you're going to hear accusations of socialism, right? You're gonna hear people talk about AOC or something like that. They're gonna say these are socialists. All I'm saying is be mindful of rhetoric. When you put things in extreme terms, it's gonna make it seem like our Democratic Party is like the next, Bolsheviks or something like that. It's not really true. They believe in a mixed economy. Canada is a mixed economy. That's the kind of thing they want. Denmark, the Scandinavian countries, successful mixed economies. All right. Now, in Congress, the party has influential centrist, progressive, and conservative wings. Now, here's what I really want you to see. Remember, we were talking about interests earlier. Look at these interests. Their interests are corporate governance reform, right? Environmental protection, support for organized labor, maintenance and expansion of social programs, affordable college tuition. Look at that, universal health care, equal opportunity, consumer protection. And on top of that, things like campaign finance reform, right? Because if you got the rich and corporations pouring tons of money into campaigns, guys, what does corruption look like? Is corruption necessarily a tyrant who's doing whatever he wants? No, it might be someone who is just has interests that conflict with those of the people because the people financing him are not the people. Do you see that? All right. Campaign finance reform, LGBT rights, criminal justice and immigration reform, stricter gun laws, abortion rights, and of course, things like legalization of marijuana. So now let's go to the Democrats. I just want to read what they have to say. Yeah, we're going to skip all that. Okay, important thing. The Republican Party was founded precisely to end slavery. So a lot of the rhetoric you hear against the Republican Party, that they're racist or things like that, just be mindful. The whole reason it was founded is to prevent slavery from spreading into Midwest, okay? All right, so Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican president, if I'm not wrong, and he ended slavery. The 21st century Republican Party ideology is American conservatism, which incorporates both economic policies and social values. Lower taxes, free market capitalism, restrictions on immigration, increased military spending, gun rights, restrictions on abortion, deregulation, and restrictions on labor unions. After the Supreme Court's 1973 decision in Roe v. Wade, the Republican Party opposed abortion in its party platform and grew its support among evangelicals. Look at the religious element, evangelicals. The GOP was strongly committed to protectionism and tariffs at its founding, but grew more supportive of free trade in the 20th century. That's it, guys. We're done. I just wanted us to go through that. Why did I go through that, guys? That word interests. Do you see that? When you process gun rights, abortion rights, what is politics? It's a whole bunch of interests that you're cramming into one leader to decide in a presidential election. But of course, there are courts. Courts are very political, right? Our current court is conservative. Legislatures are very political. They can't even give us a stimulus because they're so political. And then, of course, presidents are political, all right? All right, guys, we're done. All right, thanks for attending. I hope you guys have a great weekend.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.